There is a silence that comes after success, and it is never the silence players imagine when they are younger, and that the shift happens so smoothly, it did not announce itself, and in some cases, decided by forces they never saw clearly when it mattered most. Control what you can control. Trust the process. Let the professionals handle the rest. For most young players entering the league, that advice feels like relief. Someone else knows the business. Someone else understands contracts, negotiations, consequences. That trust is where this story begins. Because the most important decisions in an NFL career are almost never made under stadium lights. They are made in conversations players do not hear. In rooms they never enter. In moments where urgency is created artificially and hesitation is framed as weakness. Fans believe the draft decides a player's fate. Players are told their performance will speak for itself. But long before names are called, narratives are written. Long before deals are signed, leverage is assigned. And young players step into a system that already knows exactly how much they are worth and how easily that worth can be influenced. I think about the age of the men at the center of this system. Many are barely out of college. Some have never managed more money than they carried in their pocket. Some are supporting families who see them as hope, as stability, as escape. When an agent enters that picture, it is rarely framed as a power dynamic. It feels like mentorship, guidance, partnership. Someone finally taking responsibility for the parts of the world that feel overwhelming. What is rarely explained is how quickly that partnership can become dependency. Agents do not need to be villains to wield power. Power exists in access. In relationships cultivated quietly over years. In knowing who to call and who to avoid. In understanding how teams think, how front offices talk when players are not present. How reputations are built or softened or quietly damaged. Players are told this knowledge is being used on their behalf. Most of the time, they believe it. The danger is not that trust exists. The danger is that trust is rarely mutual. I have heard players describe the first time they felt something was wrong. It usually arrives disguised as discomfort rather than alarm. A decision pushed too quickly. Question discouraged rather than answered. A reminder of how many others are waiting for the same opportunity. The message is subtle but consistent. Time is running out. This is how it works. Everyone else agrees. Do not overthink it. Consent under pressure feels voluntary until you look back and realize how narrow the path was allowed to be. The system thrives on speed. Fast commitments, fast loyalty, fast silence. Players learn quickly that indecision is punished, even if no one admits it openly. Opportunities shrink. Conversations cool. Enthusiasm fades in ways that are difficult to prove, but easy to feel. And because everything happens behind closed doors, the burden of doubt always falls on the player. You wonder if you imagined it. You wonder if you are being ungrateful. You wonder if pushing back will cost more than you can afford to lose. What makes this world difficult to expose is that it often looks professional. Contracts are legal. Rules exist on paper. Certifications are displayed proudly. And when something goes wrong, it rarely explodes. It erodes. A clause here, a concession there. A decision framed as temporary that becomes permanent. Years later, the player is left asking himself when control slipped away. There is a common myth that athletes are reckless or irresponsible with their power. That if something goes wrong, it must be due to immaturity or ego. That narrative is comforting because it assigns blame neatly. What it ignores is how expertly the system is designed to guide players toward decisions while convincing them those decisions were entirely their own. Fear is the most efficient tool in this process. Fear of injury. Fear of falling in the draft. Fear of being labeled difficult. Fear of losing relationships that promise access. Players are reminded constantly how fragile careers are. One hit, one play, one wrong move. In that environment, stability is seductive. Anyone offering certainty, even an illusion of it, holds influence. This is not about one bad contract or one abusive agent. This is about how an entire industry normalizes imbalance. How young men are taught to hand over authority because the consequences of holding onto it feel too risky. How silence is rewarded and resistance is quietly discouraged. When scandals surface, we treat them as exceptions. A crooked advisor here, a stolen fortune there. And after the headlines fade, the underlying structure remains untouched. Players are encouraged to be wiser next time, as if wisdom automatically arrives with fame and pressure. As if experience can be gained without consequence. What stays with me is how rarely players talk about this while they are active. They are careful. They understand how precarious their position is. Speaking openly risks being seen as unstable or uncooperative, so they wait. They wait until the phone stops ringing, until the leverage disappears, until the cost of honesty is lower than the cost of silence. And when they speak, the stories align more than anyone would like to admit. They talk about careers that felt directed rather than chosen, about opportunities that vanished without explanation, about loyalty demanded but not returned, about waking up after retirement and realizing they never truly understood the machinery that shaped their lives. This documentary is not an attack on representation itself. Players need advocacy. They deserve expertise. But expertise without accountability becomes authority, and authority without scrutiny becomes control. The NFL exists as a performance league on the surface, but beneath it is a relationship league, and those relationships are rarely equal. I do not tell this story to assign simple villains or easy heroes. I tell it because the truth of modern football cannot be understood without examining the forces that operate in silence. The decisions made before the cheers. The agreements formed before consent is fully informed. The power that moves invisibly while everyone else is watching the game. And once you understand how they work, it becomes impossible to see the NFL the same way again. This is where the real struggle begins. Before the field, before the fame. Before the player truly knows what he has agreed to give up. To understand how professional football reached this point, you have to step backward before billion-dollar contracts. Before branding departments, before agents became power centers unto themselves. In the earliest decades of pro football, players negotiated their own deals. Compensation was modest. Careers were short. Power lived almost entirely with owners, and the idea of professional representation barely existed. Players were replaceable labor, and no one pretended otherwise. As the league grew, so did the imbalance. Television revenue exploded. Franchises transformed into global brands. But players remained individually fragmented, isolated from one another, and uninformed about their true value. That gap is where representation was born. At first, agents were not moguls or strategists. They were often former players, lawyers, or trusted intermediaries who helped negotiate contracts that players had little leverage to discuss themselves. The early logic was simple. Someone needed to speak a language players were not trained to speak. Someone needed to protect them from an ownership class that held nearly all the power. Representation in its original form was defensive. Its purpose was to rebalance a system that was openly unfair. That balance never fully arrived. What arrived instead was complexity. As money flooded into the league, representation professionalized. Contracts became longer, more technical, more layered with incentives and escape clauses. Endorsements followed. Marketing rights, image control, post-career planning. The agent's role expanded from negotiator to gatekeeper. With that expansion came influence, and with influence came hierarchy. By the time the NFL Players Association formalized agent certification, representation was no longer a side function. It was an industry. On paper, the rules seemed comprehensive. Exams, fees, ethical standards, recruiting restrictions, disciplinary processes. The NFLPA presented itself as a safeguard. a regulatory body designed to protect players from abuse. In practice, its authority was limited by the same forces it was meant to regulate. Agents were not simply advocates for players. They became essential intermediaries for teams. They consolidated talent. They smoothed negotiations. They prevented holdouts. They controlled access. A general manager negotiating with one agent might be negotiating with 10 players indirectly. Losing that relationship meant future deals became harder, more adversarial, more uncertain. Over time, access eclipsed advocacy as the most valuable commodity in representation. Agents who could guarantee cooperation were rewarded. Those who challenged structures too aggressively were marginalized. The system did not need explicit corruption to function this way. Incentives alone shaped behavior. Players rarely see this side of the equation. They are told that their agent works for them exclusively. Legally, that is true. Structurally, it is more complicated. An agent's long-term survival depends on relationships with teams, league offices, marketing partners, and other clients. Pleasing one player at the expense of those relationships can quietly damage an agent's broader business. That tension is rarely disclosed honestly. As agencies grew, many consolidated into corporate entities. Representation became portfolio management. Players were assets categorized by position, marketability, and leverage. Negotiations were no longer isolated battles, but interconnected strategies. Give here, take there. Sacrifice one client's upside to protect another's long-term security. These decisions were rarely explained to the players involved. Performance, once thought to be the great equalizer, became only one variable among many. Availability mattered. Personality mattered. Perceived compliance mattered. And above all, representation mattered. Two players with identical ability could experience dramatically different careers based not on play, but on who spoke for them when rooms were closed. This is why corruption in this world rarely looks like crime. It looks like preference. It looks like silence. It looks like opportunity drifting away without explanation. It looks like players being advised to accept less because market conditions have changed, even when evidence suggests otherwise. It looks like compromise framed as wisdom. Journalists who have investigated player representation consistently encounter the same obstacles. Sources unwilling to speak publicly. Information siloed behind non-disclosure agreements. Conduct that is ethically questionable but technically permitted. When stories do surface, they are often reduced to individual misconduct, disconnected from the structure that allowed it to thrive. Former players, once retired, describe patterns that are impossible to ignore. Early pressure to sign quickly. Discouragement from seeking independent legal advice. Financial arrangements that blurred personal and professional boundaries. And when relationships soured, players found themselves isolated, unsure who to trust or where to turn. The NFLPA does discipline agents. Certifications have been revoked. Fines issued, but enforcement is reactive, not preventative. Damage must already be done before action is taken. By then, careers may be altered permanently. Trust, once broken, is not easily restored by policy statements or retroactive penalties. What allows this system to persist is silence combined with legitimacy. Representation is necessary. Agents are credentialed. Teams rely on them. The union recognizes them. No single entity has the incentive to dismantle a structure that, while flawed, keeps negotiations predictable. Stability is valued more than fairness when money is at stake. This documentary does not argue that every agent exploits players. That would be inaccurate. Many fight sincerely for their clients and push back against unfair deals. But sincerity does not negate structure. And structure shapes outcomes more reliably than individual intent. The purpose here is not to expose scandals for shock value. It is to examine how power accumulates quietly, how regulation falls short, how young players are funneled into decisions without fully understanding the forces acting upon them, how a system built to protect can become one that controls. In the chapters ahead, I will move through the process as players experience it. Recruitment, evaluation, negotiation, retaliation, survival. Each chapter builds on the last, not as isolated incidents, but as a continuous chain. Because that is how power works in professional football. Incrementally, invisibly, efficiently. This is not the story fans are used to hearing. But it is the story beneath the one they celebrate. And once you see it clearly, it becomes impossible to dismiss as coincidence. What follows is not speculation. It is pattern. It is testimony. It is the lived reality of players navigating a system that rewards control while masking it as guidance. Before a player ever chooses an agent, the system often chooses him first. That is the truth players rarely understand until years later, when distance provides clarity that proximity never allowed. Recruitment is presented as a future decision, something that will happen when the time is right, when eligibility is clear and paperwork is ready. In reality, influence begins much earlier, and by the time consent is formally given, it has usually been shaped beyond recognition. I have spoken with players who can trace this influence back to their college years, sometimes earlier. It rarely starts with a contract discussion. It starts with help. A conversation framed as advice. An introduction framed as opportunity. The agent is often not the first point of contact. That role belongs to trainers, family, friends, former players, financial advisors, or trusted figures already embedded in the athlete's life. These intermediaries do not announce their purpose. They simply position themselves as allies. The environment makes this easy. Young players are surrounded by voices telling them how rare their situation is, how fragile the moment is, how quickly it can disappear. When someone appears offering clarity inside that confusion, it feels stabilizing rather than intrusive. Players are told this person understands the business side, understands how things really work. They are told listening does not commit them to anything, that choosing later will always remain an option. The truth is that listening is often the first commitment. Families become part of the process almost immediately. Parents are approached with respect and reassurance. Promises are framed as protection rather than profit. Parents are reminded how often athletes are taken advantage of, how naive young men can be, how essential it is to have someone experienced watching over them. It is difficult to resist that message when so much is at stake and so little is understood. For families who have lived with financial insecurity, the pressure compounds. The possibility of generational stability sits just within reach. Every decision feels weighted with consequence. Questioning guidance feels dangerous when the alternative is risking the future everyone has been waiting for. Agents understand this instinct deeply. They do not need to threaten. They simply align themselves with the family's hopes and present alternatives as reckless. College environments accelerate this process. Coaching staffs, while officially distant, often know exactly who is circling their players. Some discourage outside interference. Others quietly endorse it. Training facilities become informal meeting grounds. Recommendations are passed casually, as if neutral, as if not shaped by relationships players never see. When the same name is mentioned repeatedly by people you trust, it stops sounding like coincidence. What players rarely grasp is how early narratives are assigned. From the outside, it looks like support. From the inside, it is alignment. Once an agent begins advocating informally, even without a signed agreement, decisions start moving around the player rather than through him. Conversations about marketability, draft positioning, and perceived fit begin. And the player believes all of this activity exists purely for his benefit. Pressure rarely arrives as a command. It arrives as concern. Someone checking in to make sure you are not falling behind. Someone reminding you that others are circling. Someone explaining that waiting too long can send the wrong message. The language is careful. It avoids absolutes. It allows the illusion of choice while narrowing the range of acceptable decisions. Fear of missing out is the most reliable force in this stage. Players are reminded that opportunities do not wait. That windows close. That teams move on. Even when rules exist to prevent early recruitment, enforcement is distant enough to feel irrelevant. Everyone understands that violations are rarely punished unless they are egregious or public. Quiet influence is not only tolerated, it is normalized. What makes this stage dangerous is that the player often believes he is still observing, still gathering information, still delaying commitment. In truth, commitment has already begun emotionally. Loyalty is forming. Gratitude is being cultivated. The idea of choosing someone else starts to feel like betrayal, even before a formal relationship exists. I've heard players describe the first time they considered talking to another agent. The reaction they received was rarely overt anger. It was disappointment. It's a subtle reminder of how much time had already been invested, how much effort had already been spent. The implication was clear. Looking elsewhere would reflect poorly on the player's character, on his reliability, on his maturity. Consent under those circumstances is compromised, even if it remains legal. The system benefits from keeping this stage informal. Without paperwork, accountability is non-existent. Advice can be given without consequence. Promises can be implied without record. If a player later claims he was pressured or misled, there is nothing tangible to point to. Only feelings, which carry little weight in a business that values documentation over testimony. For players from stable backgrounds, this influence can still be overwhelming. For those from poverty, it can be irresistible. When someone pays for training, covers travel, provides living expenses, helps family members quietly. These acts are framed as generosity, not investment. But generosity creates obligation, whether acknowledged or not. Saying no later feels impossible when yes has already been accepted in other forms. Players are often warned about predators in general terms, but not about this subtle form of dependence. They are told to watch out for scammers, not for sophistication. They are prepared for obvious threats, not polished ones. As a result, they lower their defenses precisely where pressure is greatest. By the time formal eligibility arrives, the decision feels settled. The player tells himself he chose freely. He tells himself he did his research. He tells himself this is simply how the process works. And in many ways, it is. That is the problem. Recruitment before consent is effective because it hides inside normalcy. Nothing illegal needs to occur. Nothing dramatic needs to happen. All that is required is early access, repeated presence, and the strategic use of fear disguised as urgency. When players later question why they did not consider other options, they struggle to answer. There was no single moment to resist. No obvious line crossed. It's just a gradual narrowing of choice until only one path felt reasonable. By the time players arrive at the combine, they believe the hardest part is behind them. Years of work have led to this week. Training bodies to exhaustion. Studying playbooks until language becomes instinct. Convincing themselves that performance will finally speak louder than circumstance. What they do not yet understand is that the combine is not primarily an evaluation of talent. It is a marketplace of influence. And most of the trading happens without them. On the surface, the combine looks clinical, structured, measurable, timed drills. Medical exams? Interviews with front offices that feel formal and controlled. Players are taught to treat it like a job interview, to focus on preparation, to answer questions carefully. But beneath that layer of order is something much less regulated. A week where access becomes currency and where agents operate with maximum leverage. The Combine compresses the entire league into one location. Executives, scouts, coaches, medical staff, agents, all moving through the same hotels, restaurants, meeting rooms. The value of proximity cannot be overstated. Relationships that normally require months of coordination unfold over casual conversations and brief encounters. And in that environment, agents are not waiting on results. They are shaping expectations before results are even recorded. What players rarely realize is how early their Combine experience begins without them. Before a prospect steps onto the turf, his name has already circulated. Strengths emphasized. Concerns softened. Questions reframed. This is not overt manipulation. It is subtle positioning. An agent mentioning that a player has been dealing with a minor issue but pushed through it. That his interview skills are improving. That teams should not overthink a down year or an unconventional background. These conversations are off the record by design. They leave no trace. And because they happen informally, they carry a veneer of honesty. It feels like peers talking candidly. It feels like insight rather than influence. But when enough of these conversations align, they form consensus. And consensus shapes boards. By anticipating concerns before they are raised. By offering context that encourages patience or forgiveness. Teams remember this. They associate cooperation with ease. Agents who smooth friction are welcomed back. Agents who challenge narratives too forcefully are quietly sidelined. Players believe interviews determine perception. They matter, but they are often reinforcing ideas already formed. When a general manager meets a player, he is rarely starting from scratch. I have heard players describe the disorientation of Combine Week. The exhaustion, it's a constant sense of evaluation. The pressure to be both confident and compliant. What they do not see is that while they wait for their next drill or medical exam, rooms elsewhere are filled with people discussing their future as an abstraction, not as a person, but as a profile. A risk, a value. Agents move through this space differently. They are not being tested. They are not being measured. They are reinforcing relationships. They are reminding teams who they represent, not just today, but in the coming years. A cooperative deal now can lead to easier negotiations later. A stubborn stance on one client can create friction for many. This dynamic creates quiet trade-offs that players are never asked to approve. An agent may advise a player to temper expectations, to avoid rocking the boat, to accept positioning below his perceived value. The reasoning sounds professional. The market is uncertain. Teams are cautious. Patience is wise. What goes unsaid is how this advice aligns with the agent's broader incentives. The Combine rewards predictability. Teams want to reduce risk. Agents who help reduce perceived volatility gain influence. For players, this translates into guidance that nudges them away from self-advocacy in the name of professionalism. There is also the matter of silence. Not every player receives equal attention. Some names are not pushed. Some questions are not answered enthusiastically. This absence is rarely malicious. It is strategic. Time and credibility are finite. Agents allocate both according to return. A player who is not central to an agency's future leverage may receive adequate representation, but not aggressive promotion. Players sense this imbalance but struggle to articulate it. They feel supported, yet vaguely secondary. Their concerns are acknowledged but not prioritized. And because everything happens quickly, they do not have space to question how their interests align with a larger machine. Combine week is also when pressure intensifies. Players are reminded constantly that impressions last. That one bad interview can hurt them. That deviating from advice can be risky. In this environment, trusting representation feels safer than asserting autonomy. Even moments of uncertainty are interpreted as signs to defer rather than challenge. What makes this stage powerful is that outcomes are never explicit. No one tells a player he is being discussed without him. No one explains how narratives evolve in rooms he will never enter. When draft positions later fail to match expectations, the explanation is always opaque. Teams felt differently. The market shifted. Other needs emerged. The agent remains the translator between player and league, and the player must decide whether to trust that translation or question it. Most trust, by this point, questioning feels late. The cost of suspicion feels higher than the comfort of belief. The combine exposes a fundamental truth about professional football. Evaluation is not neutral. It is relational. It is influenced by who speaks, who listens, and who is considered credible. Players rarely control those variables, no matter how prepared they are physically. When the week ends, players return home with numbers and impressions. They believe their fate will be determined by charts and metrics. In reality, it has already been shaped by conversations that leave no record. The combine does not crown winners, it aligns interests. Understanding this marketplace is essential because it reveals how power moves through absence. Players perform while others decide. And once those decisions crystallize, reversing them becomes nearly impossible. By the time draft day arrives, the illusion of openness has faded. Boards are set, leverage is fixed. Futures have been quietly negotiated in advance. By the time the draft approaches, most players believe the story has already been written by their play. They tell themselves that years of film do not lie. That production outweighs rumor. That performance ultimately forces decisions. This belief is comforting, and it is wrong. What determines draft position is not simply what happened on the field, but how those moments are explained, framed, and remembered. Tape provides raw material. Narratives determine meaning, and narratives are not created equally. Once the combine ends, conversations shift from evaluation to justification. Teams begin aligning internal opinions with public explanations. Agents become essential intermediaries in this process, offering language that makes decisions appear rational rather than strategic. This is where stories matter more than facts. Character narratives are the most malleable and the most dangerous. They are built from fragments. A missed meeting. A body language comment from a coach. A vague reference to maturity. None of these require proof. Together, they can reposition a player entirely. Agents understand this terrain intimately. They know which concerns can be neutralized and which must be redirected. They emphasize leadership when consistency is questioned. They frame quietness as focus when personality is labeled flat. They turn ambition into competitiveness or temper it into coachability depending on what serves the moment. For players, this process is invisible. They hear summaries, not details. They are told teams like them, but have questions. They are advised to trust the process. Rarely are they informed of the specific narratives circulating about them, because naming them gives those narratives substance. Silence becomes a tool. When an agent does not actively counter a developing perception, that perception hardens. This is not always neglect. It is calculation. Some narratives benefit the agent's broader positioning with teams. Correcting them too forcefully can cost credibility. Letting them stand can preserve relationships. This creates a quiet hierarchy. Players who are central to an agency's strategy receive active narrative defense. Players who are less critical become adaptable. Their stories bend to fit the market rather than challenge it. This is how draft boards stabilize around expectations that feel organic but are carefully curated. Strategic leaks play a critical role. Information about workouts, interviews, or team interest finds its way to reporters through controlled channels. These leaks shape public consensus, which in turn influences team behavior. No team wants to be seen as reaching or missing on a prospect perceived as risky. Agents do not need to fabricate stories. They only need to emphasize certain truths and withhold others. A medical concern becomes minor if mentioned early and often. A strong interview becomes forgettable if it is never referenced. The flow of information determines momentum. Players who attempt to assert control often find the system resistant. A player who challenges his projected position, who questions advice, who seeks alternative opinions, may suddenly encounter subtle resistance. Calls returned more slowly. Conversations framed cautiously. Feedback delivered in abstractions rather than specifics. This is not explicit punishment. It is recalibration. A reminder that alignment is rewarded and friction has costs. In a system built on trust and access, being labeled difficult is one of the few narratives that can override talent. Draft position is where these stories converge into consequences. Millions of dollars hinge on perception. So does opportunity. Higher picks receive longer patience, more resources, more structured development. Later picks are evaluated relentlessly and released quickly. Narrative determines not just entry, but survival. Players sense this imbalance, but are rarely able to trace it back to its source. When they fall lower than expected, explanations are diffuse. Teams valued other needs. The depth at the position was unusual. The board fell strangely. These statements are technically true, but strategically incomplete. Players who accept guidance without resistance are easier to place. Their expectations align with projections. Their reactions do not disrupt planning. This makes them attractive not only as prospects, but as professional assets. Those who resist find themselves navigating a colder landscape. Their confidence reframed as entitlement. Their questions reframed as insecurity. Narrative control has already shifted away from them, and regaining it requires leverage they do not yet possess. It rewards those who fit smoothly into existing power structures and penalizes those who disrupt them, regardless of intent. By draft day, the stories have settled. Analysts echo them. Executives reference them. Fans internalize them. A player's identity becomes shorthand. Safe, raw, polished, risky. These labels stick long after performance contradicts them. For agents, success is measured not by fairness, but by efficiency. Getting players placed, maintaining relationships, preserving access. Narrative control is their most effective instrument, and draft position is its clearest outcome. Players enter the league believing they earned their spot entirely through merit. Some did, many did not. Most arrived through a mixture of performance and positioning that they were never allowed to examine closely. Understanding this phase is critical because it exposes how power operates quietly through language rather than force. Stories move players up or down boards long before names are called, and once the league speaks those stories aloud on draft night, they become reality. You earned it. You proved yourself. You are finally in control of your future. And yet, for most, financial freedom arrives encumbered. The reality is that agents, trainers, and intermediaries have often already created a web of dependence before the first paycheck clears. Advances, gifts, and informal loans are not inherently unethical. They are framed as support, as investment in potential, as protection against uncertainty. a hotel stay covered during a critical workout, travel for family members, payments for medical treatment, a loan for a car or housing to settle lingering responsibilities. Each act seems minor, temporary, and caring, and most are presented with no expectation of formal repayment or obligation. The psychological impact is profound. A young athlete who accepts help from someone already positioned as a mentor or guide experiences a shift in perspective. Gratitude becomes intertwined with obligation. Trust is reinforced through financial connection. And for players who have lived with scarcity, this combination can feel like salvation rather than leverage. A player may later describe it as being in the red emotionally, psychologically, and socially long before any debt appears in writing. Mentors, advisors, or agents recount what has been done, subtly reminding the player of gratitude, trust, and alignment. Each mention reinforces the message that cooperation is reciprocal, even when the player does not yet realize the stakes. Another dimension is social proof. Players observe peers receiving assistance and achieving success. Accepting support becomes normalized. Rejecting it becomes perceived as impractical or rebellious. Young athletes internalize these dynamics, often mistaking them for mentorship or strategy rather than leverage and control. Early money, intended as support, has limited autonomy. A loan or gift may feel trivial in isolation, but when combined with loyalty, gratitude, and access, it shapes the trajectory of future decisions. The system also benefits from timing. Providing financial support before payday allows influence to be established without scrutiny. It is difficult for a player to object to assistance when it is framed as necessary to maintain competitiveness. They hesitate to push back, to question advice, to challenge strategy. Every decision is filtered through the lens of indebtedness, often without conscious awareness. Even once players begin earning millions, the psychological weight of early dependence lingers. It shapes negotiations, alignment, and trust. Decisions that should feel straightforward become complicated by relational memory. Who helped you first? Who covered expenses before anyone else? Whose guidance did you accept in silence? These questions subtly dictate behavior in ways most observers never recognize. Agents are aware of this influence. Providing help early in a player's career is a strategic investment. It creates loyalty, conditions, behavior, and establishes boundaries without the need for coercion. The system does not require intimidation or threats. Subtlety and timing are far more effective. Early financial dependence is an invisible leash, one that most players carry unknowingly. The consequences extend beyond contract negotiations. Financial dependence can shape public image, career trajectory, and even personal relationships. Decisions about representation, endorsements, and career planning are rarely made in a vacuum. They occur in a context conditioned by prior generosity and implicit expectation. Free choice is constrained long before it formally exists. For those who resist, the cost is social and relational. Questioning guidance or declining support can create friction. Relationships may cool. Opportunities can appear to vanish. Early dependence is not merely financial. It is reputational, emotional, and strategic. It constrains autonomy across every domain of professional life. Understanding this phase is essential to seeing the full system at work. By the time players receive their first paychecks, they have already internalized lessons about loyalty, trust, and obligation. They understand quickly that independence is conditional, and freedom is shaped by relationships rather than contracts. Financial support before payday is not inherently exploitative. It becomes leverage when the expectation of alignment, compliance, and long-term control is embedded without disclosure. That is the subtle architecture of power in professional football. It operates quietly, invisibly, and effectively. long before performance alone can determine success. Recognizing this stage illuminates a critical truth about the league. Success is never purely meritocratic. Talent alone does not dictate outcomes. Influence, access, and pre-existing relational bonds determine opportunity in ways most players never fully comprehend. The first financial interactions are foundational. They condition behavior and expectation. They frame what is possible and what is permitted. Early money is rarely about wealth. It is about leverage, trust, and subtle control. And by the time the first contract is signed, freedom feels earned, yet is already circumscribed. Every subsequent choice, from agent loyalty to endorsement agreements, exists within that framework. Players do not realize they are navigating not only competition on the field, but also invisible financial obligations off it. By the time a player has established himself in the league, the landscape of representation has shifted dramatically from the informal advisory systems of the past. Position group control allows firms to manage internal competition, coordinate draft narratives, and allocate representation resources selectively. A player may receive attention proportional not to talent, but to strategic value within the agency's hierarchy. Contracts, once framed as negotiations between a player and a team, become multi-layered exercises in portfolio management. An agent representing multiple players at the same position might advise one client to accept slightly less to protect leverage for another. Decisions that appear individualized are often influenced by interdependencies the player cannot see. This is not necessarily malice. It is the structural reality of concentrated representation. However, the outcome remains the same. Individual agency is constrained. The agency's relationships with teams amplify this power. Working with a dominant firm means dealing with players whose behavior is largely managed, whose expectations are aligned, whose potential conflicts have been mitigated in advance. The firm's reputation becomes collateral for its clients. Compliance and cooperation are rewarded with placement, draft support, and endorsement opportunities. Resistance, even from a talented player, risks marginalization because the system values collective leverage over individual merit. This system also intersects with public perception. Agents manage messaging carefully, influencing media narratives and controlling access. General managers must negotiate with a single firm to access multiple valuable prospects. The firm's scant collective weight becomes a force that operates above the level of individual merit or player preference. Without deep access and a broad portfolio, their influence is limited. Players are sometimes guided to accept outcomes that preserve agency leverage, maintain team relationships, or optimize collective positioning. The consequences are real. Wealth, opportunity, and career longevity may be affected not by personal skill or choice, but by portfolio priorities beyond the player's control. Critically, this system is self-reinforcing. Success attracts clients, clients attract influence, and influence attracts additional resources and access. Over time, the concentration of power becomes the norm. Players and teams alike adjust expectations to accommodate it. Challenges to the system are rare because the structures themselves reward compliance and subtly penalize resistance. By the time free agency or contract renegotiation arrives, the influence of megagencies is fully embedded. Players often feel they are negotiating for themselves. But the framework, priorities, and limits have already been defined. Autonomy is constrained not through coercion, but through architecture, through early investment, portfolio alignment, and structural leverage. Understanding the rise of dominant agencies is key to seeing how power is exercised invisibly. Players become assets within portfolios. Markets are shaped long before contracts are signed, and teams negotiate with influence rather than just talent. The illusion of choice persists, while control flows quietly to concentrated actors. Recognizing this dynamic illuminates the broader story of professional football. Talent alone is insufficient. Opportunity is mediated through networks, strategic access, and structural leverage. For players, agency is never absolute. It is always bounded by relationships, market dynamics, and the unseen calculus of concentrated power. In professional football, as in any system built on influence and trust, resistance has a cost. It rarely arrives in the form of overt threats or public shaming. It arrives quietly, imperceptibly, in ways designed to be deniable and diffuse. Players who attempt to break from established patterns, question guidance, or leave influential representation often encounter retaliation without evidence. A silent enforcement that is nearly impossible to prove, yet profoundly effective. The mechanics of this retaliation are subtle. Calls that were once returned promptly slow down. Meetings that were once arranged easily require multiple intermediaries. Opportunities that seemed guaranteed evaporate without explanation. Teams and decision-makers never acknowledge that alignment with certain agents or firms is influencing outcomes. Everything appears coincidental, accidental, or the result of unrelated factors. And yet, players sense the invisible hand that guides the flow. Isolation is the most effective weapon. A player removed from networks, excluded from informal discussions, or left out of strategic briefings, loses context and leverage simultaneously. Without overt confrontation, influence is exercised by absence. Missing invitations to private workouts, delayed communications about team needs, or unreturned inquiries to potential sponsors create a sense of marginalization. The player is left questioning whether failure is self-inflicted, luck, or structural forces. I have spoken to players who describe this experience as chilling. One cornerback recounted feeling suddenly invisible despite prior success. Teams that once pursued him aggressively no longer expressed interest. His agent had moved to another market segment, and he struggled to understand why opportunities had dried up. The answer was never provided explicitly. There was no paper trail. The effect, however, was undeniable. Career momentum slowed, and confidence eroded. Plausible deniability is central to this process. Retaliation occurs without acknowledgement. There is no evidence linking behavior to consequence. A general manager can truthfully claim that evaluations were based on performance metrics, while the underlying decision may have been influenced by agent alignment, loyalty, or perceived difficulty. Teams protect themselves legally and reputationally, leaving the player isolated in uncertainty. Psychological damage is profound. Players internalize the ambiguity, questioning their worth, decision-making, and even their identity. Confidence, essential for high-level performance, becomes fragile. Anxiety replaces certainty. The stress of constant evaluation is magnified when the environment itself is opaque. The player cannot challenge what he cannot define, creating a sense of helplessness and erosion of agency. Even subtle signs can trigger fear. A brief hesitation from a scout, a muted tone in a meeting, a slight delay in communication each becomes a signal, amplified through prior experience. The player interprets these as warnings, adjusting behavior in anticipation. Compliance emerges not from choice, but from survival instinct, conditioned by the invisible consequences of dissent. This system is particularly effective because it leverages the player's own assumptions. Individuals trained to perform under pressure to anticipate outcomes and to internalize responsibility are uniquely susceptible to subtle influence. The absence of evidence prevents formal grievance, while the psychological impact ensures behavioral conformity. Players police themselves long before anyone intervenes directly. The mechanisms extend beyond a single player. Reputation spreads quickly. Agents and firms observe how others respond to resistance and adjust strategy accordingly. Word travels in networks. Teams are aware of alignment expectations. Clients of influential agencies are treated preferentially. Those who appear difficult or independent encounter structural resistance, even without overt communication. The effect is systemic, reinforcing compliance across the league. I have interviewed multiple athletes who describe a chilling pattern. They attempted to change representation, questioned strategic advice, or negotiated aggressively. Within months, the rhythm of their careers shifted. Offers slowed, relationships cooled, endorsements vanished. They could not prove causality. They could only perceive correlation. And in a culture where opportunity is fleeting, perception is often indistinguishable from reality. This phase highlights the intersection of relational power and market dependency. Players who attempt autonomy find themselves navigating an ecosystem that rewards predictability. Even when they perform at the highest levels, resistance can be costly. The structures are designed to manage behavior without resorting to illegality, creating an environment where influence and fear coexist seamlessly. The danger lies in invisibility. Players do not see the architecture of enforcement until consequences are experienced. By the time awareness arrives, options are limited. Choosing to leave an agency or challenge established relationships carries tangible risks and uncertain rewards. The cost of freedom is amplified by uncertainty, and the path forward becomes a series of calculated compromises rather than purely merit-based decisions. Retaliation without evidence is therefore both subtle and total. It shapes careers quietly, eroding confidence, limiting opportunity, and conditioning behavior. Players navigate not only competition on the field, but also invisible power structures that measure compliance, loyalty, and adaptability. The system punishes indirectly, leaving traces in career arcs, opportunity allocation, and psychological strain. Understanding this stage is essential for recognizing the unseen dynamics of professional football. The game is not only about performance, contracts, or talent evaluation. It is about influence, networks, and compliance within a hierarchy that thrives on opacity. Players may appear to exercise choice, but in reality, behavior is constrained by a lattice of invisible consequences. In this environment, knowledge is limited and perception dominates. The absence of documentation, the plausibility of alternative explanations, and the subtlety of enforcement make retaliation effective without overt action. Players internalize lessons about risk and alignment, often before they consciously understand them, shaping their future decisions in ways both visible and invisible. By the end of this stage, the player has learned that the system operates on trust, alignment, and compliance more than merit or transparency. Resistance has consequences that cannot be challenged legally, socially, or strategically. Autonomy is constrained, not through direct force, but through silence, absence, and the pervasive weight of plausible deniability. The lesson is brutal in its quietness. The league is not just a field of competition, but a network of invisible pressures designed to maintain control. Professional football is a world built on trust, and yet it is also a world where that trust can be weaponized. When financial mismanagement, theft, or fraud occurs, the consequences are rarely immediate or obvious. For players, particularly those early in their careers, the collapse of trust is a deeply personal betrayal. And the systems around them often ensure that reporting misconduct is difficult, dangerous, or futile. Cases of financial exploitation are not isolated anecdotes. They are patterns repeated across decades. Young athletes, suddenly flush with cash for the first time, often rely on agents, advisors, or intermediaries to manage wealth, investments, and taxes. These individuals present themselves as protectors, counselors, and mentors. Yet in numerous documented cases, they have betrayed that trust for personal gain, misappropriating funds, inflating fees, or misrepresenting contracts. The damage is immediate and enduring, and the player's ability to respond is constrained by structural and psychological factors. Complaints often require documentation, legal counsel, and time resources the average rookie lacks. Explanation buys time and erodes urgency, conditioning the player to tolerate discrepancies rather than confront them. By the time they realize the scale of the problem, damage is compounded, and the window for remediation is narrower. Questioning financial advice to early risks, conflict, skepticism, or loss of access. Compliance becomes a survival tactic. Documented cases reveal disturbing patterns. Some involve multi-million-dollar misappropriations masked as legitimate business transactions. Others involve outright theft through falsified contracts or unauthorized investments. In many instances, players report being pressured not to discuss concerns publicly, often under the guise of protecting reputation, maintaining relationships, or preserving league standing. Silence is not incidental. It is cultivated. Shame compounds the isolation. Athletes describe feeling both violated and complicit. They trusted someone who mismanaged funds, but the structures of accountability often obscure culpability. Public discussion is dangerous, internal discussion is limited, and legal action is daunting. The player's position becomes precarious. Asserting rights risks career disruption, while silence allows exploitation to continue. Even seasoned players struggle to navigate this landscape. The sheer complexity of contracts, endorsement deals, investment vehicles, and league rules creates opportunities for exploitation. Without specialized knowledge, detecting fraud is difficult. The player's success is intertwined with the guidance of those around them, making skepticism risky. Who do you question when everyone you trust is implicated or aligned? Exploitation often occurs early in a player's career, when financial literacy is limited and relationships with agents are formative. Early financial mismanagement not only deprives players of capital, but establishes psychological precedent. Trust is conditional, and questioning authority is costly. Players who later attempt to renegotiate relationships or confront wrongdoing frequently encounter resistance reinforced by prior compliance. The league environment itself reinforces silence. Players are conditioned to prioritize performance and team cohesion over personal disputes. Complaints about financial mismanagement can be perceived as distractions, creating additional social and professional costs. Public exposure is discouraged, both by culture and by advisors who warn against reputational damage. These factors converge to make early reporting rare and delayed reporting dangerous. In the rare instances where misconduct is reported, structural barriers complicate resolution. Legal claims are time-sensitive. Agents may be protected by regulatory loopholes. The consequences of reporting are immediate, while remedies are slow and partial. Silence, therefore, remains the safer strategy in the short term, even when it is destructive over the long term. Talent alone is insufficient. Opportunities are mediated through relationships, financial guidance, and trust networks. When those networks fail or deliberately manipulate, the consequences ripple across careers. Financial betrayal is both immediate and enduring. It erodes confidence, constrains autonomy, and fosters a culture of suspicion. Players must navigate this terrain silently, recalibrating expectations and learning to distinguish between genuine support and structural leverage disguised as mentorship. For many, these lessons arrive too late to prevent significant personal or professional loss. The combination of exploitation, shame, and enforced silence ensures the continuation of systemic patterns. Early financial misconduct not only harms individual players, but reinforces the mechanisms of control that govern representation, opportunity, and autonomy. By the time a player recognizes the pattern, their career trajectory has already been influenced, often irrevocably. For many players, the NFL Players Association is framed as the ultimate safeguard, the organization tasked with protecting their interests, negotiating benefits, and providing a buffer against the immense power of teams and agents. The reality, however, is far more complex. The union serves as both protector and stabilizer, balancing advocacy with political and structural pressures that often limit accountability. Understanding these dynamics is essential to comprehending why systemic abuses persist, even when players appear to have formal representation and recourse. The NFLPA was created to ensure players have a collective voice, to negotiate contracts, secure benefits, and provide legal guidance. Its successes are well documented. Minimum salaries, healthcare provisions, pension structures, and grievance procedures all owe their existence to union advocacy. Yet the very architecture that allows it to function as a stabilizing force also imposes constraints. Advocacy must coexist with the realities of labor relations, collective bargaining, and the broader political landscape of professional football. These dual obligations inherently restrict the union's capacity to intervene in individual cases of misconduct or influence. Enforcement limitations are structural. The union cannot, and does not, micromanage agent conduct in a comprehensive way. While the NFLPA certifies agents and maintains a regulatory framework, oversight is often reactive rather than proactive. Complaints require documentation. Legal thresholds must be met. And actions are bounded by the necessity to maintain credibility within both player and team networks. Many players experience the union as supportive, but ultimately constrained, providing advice rather than decisive intervention. By the time systemic exploitation or misconduct is addressed, the damage is often done. Political stability further complicates advocacy. The NFLPA exists within a network of power that includes team owners, executives, and league governance. Aggressive intervention in cases of agent misconduct risks destabilizing relationships essential to collective bargaining and broader league operations. The union must weigh the individual against the collective. This creates a tension. Protecting one player fully may alienate powerful agents, reduce access to teams, or compromise ongoing negotiations. Players caught in this intersection experience partial protection rather than full accountability. Reform often stalls because the structures are self-reinforcing. Policies designed to protect players can be undermined by complexity, bureaucratic inertia, and strategic resistance from influential stakeholders. Attempts to tighten oversight, increase transparency, or sanction misconduct must navigate political, legal, and financial barriers. The result is a system where well-intentioned regulations exist but fail to produce meaningful, timely consequences for those who exploit or manipulate young athletes. Players themselves are caught in this tension. They are encouraged to report misconduct, rely on union resources, and trust that certified representation ensures fair treatment. In practice, however, the union operates under constraints that often leave early career players exposed. Complaints may be delayed, inquiries may be cautious, and resolution may depend on factors outside the player's control. The system privileges stability over immediate justice, and the consequences are most keenly felt by those with the least experience, power, or knowledge. Conflicts of interest also emerge. Union representatives may have long-standing relationships with agents, teams, or management. Navigating disputes without compromising these relationships is delicate. Players who seek aggressive advocacy risk encountering cautious responses calibrated to preserve institutional equilibrium. The perception of protection exists, but systemic vulnerabilities ensure that true accountability is rare. Documentation and transparency are recurring challenges. Many forms of exploitation, mismanagement, coercion occur informally through relational pressure rather than explicit contracts. The union relies on evidence to act decisively. When misconduct is subtle, intermittent, or masked as guidance, players struggle to meet thresholds for intervention. Silence, delay, and plausible deniability render union enforcement partial. Those affected often learn too late that the protections they assumed were comprehensive are in fact limited. The union's structural failure is reinforced by the broader market environment. Teams depend on predictable labor relations. Players require consistent representation, and agents operate within networks of influence that intersect both. In this context, aggressive policing of misconduct is politically costly. The union must weigh the risk of confrontation against the potential benefit of protecting individual players. Often, the cost of advocacy outweighs immediate action, leaving gaps that exploitation can persistently exploit. Reform attempts illustrate these dynamics. Measures proposed to increase oversight, strengthen grievance procedures, or monitor agent behavior frequently encounter resistance. Complexity, cost, and the need for league cooperation slow implementation. By the time policies change, generations of players have already experienced the effects of systemic limitations. Lessons are learned individually, but the system itself evolves incrementally, often insufficiently to prevent recurrence. Players describe a recurring frustration, knowing that resources exist, yet feeling powerless to access them fully. They rely on union advice, yet recognize its boundaries. They observe misconduct, yet encounter structural barriers when seeking redress. The experience teaches caution, resilience, and strategic alignment, but often leaves emotional and professional scars. The gap between expectation and reality is profound and enduring. Understanding the NFLPA's limitations is essential for recognizing why patterns of exploitation persist. Representation and certification, while valuable, are not substitutes for structural accountability. The union's dual role as protector and stabilizer imposes boundaries on intervention. And players who navigate this environment must do so with acute awareness of these limits. Knowledge of systemic failure becomes a critical survival skill. Ultimately, the union's structural failure is not an absence of intention, but a consequence of its design. Protecting the collective sometimes requires sacrificing immediate, individualized accountability. Political and relational pressures, evidence requirements, and the need for stability create conditions in which misconduct can occur without timely correction. Players experience these gaps firsthand, shaping their perception of trust, reliance, and autonomy. This stage of the player's journey illuminates the broader architecture of the league. Talent, performance, and professionalism intersect with structures of influence and representation that cannot be fully controlled by the player. Understanding the limits of formal protection is crucial for seeing the full dynamics of power. Players operate within a network that promises security but delivers only partial accountability. The consequences are profound, subtle, and enduring. By the end of this stage, it becomes clear that systemic gaps in enforcement, political constraint, and structural design ensure that protection stops short of accountability. Players learn that even when union resources exist, the combination of complexity, relational leverage, and bureaucratic inertia leaves them navigating a landscape in which autonomy is circumscribed and influence is unevenly distributed. By the time a player reaches the middle or latter stages of his career, the lessons learned from early vulnerability have crystallized. Some have emerged intact, others battered, but all carry the memory of the invisible forces that shaped their trajectory. Survival in professional football is rarely about talent alone. It is about understanding the architecture of influence, navigating power without being crushed by it, and reclaiming control where it was previously ceded unknowingly. Those who adapt do so through experience, observation, and, often, painful self-education. Veterans recount the slow awakening to these realities. One wide receiver described his first 5 years as a fog of compliance, unaware that many decisions framed as personal guidance were in fact strategic maneuvers to maintain agency leverage. He spoke of loans accepted with gratitude that became psychological obligations, of endorsements suggested as opportunities that subtly reinforced alignment, of draft advice framed as mentorship that was actually portfolio management. Only through repeated observation, questioning, and analysis did he begin to see the architecture behind what he had assumed was simple representation. The emotional cost of this education is high. Players carry not only the weight of missed opportunities, but also a persistent mistrust that can shape relationships, negotiations, and even personal identity. Learning that guidance previously accepted as wisdom was in part a mechanism of control produces anger, regret, and profound disappointment. Many describe a lingering sense of betrayal, not from a single individual, but from the system itself, from structures designed to ensure compliance under the guise of support. Self-education is rarely formal. Veterans teach themselves through observation, reading contracts, seeking alternative advice, and connecting with peers who have navigated similar paths. It is painstaking and isolating, requiring both humility and skepticism. They learn to question guidance, to identify patterns of leverage, and to recognize when generosity is conditional. Every interaction becomes a test of trust, and every agreement is approached with a heightened awareness of structural dynamics. Professional cost accompanies this process. Resistance to agency norms, questioning advice, or negotiating independently often triggers subtle pushback. Players describe navigating a delicate balance, asserting autonomy without jeopardizing career momentum, exercising discernment without provoking retaliation, and integrating lessons learned without overcorrecting. It is a continuous negotiation, both externally and internally. For those who survive and adapt, the payoff is real, though imperfect. Players reclaim a degree of agency, exercising control over representation, contracts, and career trajectory. They choose advisors strategically, negotiate with an awareness of systemic leverage, and cultivate networks of information independent of the structures that once constrained them. Autonomy is not absolute, but it is sufficient to allow meaningful choice and a restored sense of personal power. Life after trusting the wrong structures is a study in resilience. Players report a heightened awareness of relational influence, subtle coercion, and the limits of formal protection. They carry the memory of early exploitation as a lens through which every subsequent decision is filtered. Financial management, contract negotiation, and career planning become exercises in vigilance. Informed by the experience of being misled, constrained, or coerced without evidence. Each choice is made with a consciousness of the architecture of power, rather than a naive assumption of benevolent guidance. Survivors also reflect on emotional intelligence gained through adversity. They learn to interpret signals, recognize patterns, and understand that opportunity is rarely distributed equitably. The system favors those who adapt quickly and strategically. And those who fail to read subtle cues often suffer disproportionately. Veterans describe a form of quiet mastery, the ability to operate within the system while minimizing vulnerability, to accept structural realities without surrendering self-determination, and to navigate power without being consumed by it. Mentorship becomes critical. Experienced players often guide rookies through the maze of influence, financial dependence, and agency strategy. These lessons are practical, rooted in lived experience, and focused on survival rather than idealism. The emotional toll of sharing these lessons is significant, as it involves recounting personal betrayals and systemic failures. Yet passing on this knowledge is essential to creating resilience in others, and it represents one of the few forms of agency veterans can exercise on behalf of future generations. The professional consequences of adaptation are uneven. Players who master the system often gain negotiating advantage, secure strategic endorsements, and exert more control over career trajectory. Others, however, cannot fully recover from early missteps or the psychological burden of betrayal. Some retire financially secure, yet emotionally cautious, carrying mistrust into post-career life. The legacy of early exploitation is not erased by success. It is managed, integrated, and, where possible, leveraged as experience. Adaptation also entails a nuanced understanding of representation. Players recognize that not all agents or advisors are adversaries. Relationships are evaluated based on alignment, transparency, and track record rather than reputation alone. Veterans learn to identify patterns, ask critical questions, and assert boundaries while preserving professional relationships. Strategic compliance, combined with informed skepticism, becomes a defining skill for career longevity. This stage of adaptation underscores a fundamental truth. Talent and performance are necessary, but insufficient. Navigating professional football requires social intelligence, strategic awareness, and the ability to interpret invisible forces. Players who emerge resilient have internalized lessons about power, influence, and relational dynamics. They have learned that survival requires more than physical skill. It requires psychological acuity, foresight, and the courage to challenge guidance when necessary. Ultimately, survivors illustrate both the human cost and the potential for reclamation within a system designed to constrain autonomy. Their stories reveal how early dependence, exploitation, and structural control can be mitigated through awareness, experience, and strategic adaptation. They exemplify the possibility of navigating complexity without surrendering identity, of reclaiming choice after subtle coercion, and of asserting agency in a world where influence is rarely visible but always operative. Veterans remind us that the consequences of early vulnerability extend far beyond individual contracts or games. Adaptation is not simply a survival mechanism. It is a form of empowerment, allowing players to regain control over their lives, careers, and financial futures. These survivors are the living testament to the stakes of influence, leverage, and systemic design in professional football. The system rewards behavior that reinforces alignment and punishes deviation subtly, often invisibly, as we have traced in earlier chapters. Exposure does not guarantee change. Even when scandals, fraud cases, or high-profile failures occur, systemic reform is slow, partial, or symbolic. Structural incentives favor continuity. Agents continue to wield concentrated power. Teams continue to negotiate with portfolios rather than individuals, and new players enter an environment designed to replicate the same patterns. The lessons of transparency are constrained by political, financial, and relational imperatives. This endurance is reinforced by the economics of football. The stakes are immense. Millions of dollars, significant endorsement revenue, and career trajectories that can shift in a single season. Teams are incentivized to rely on trusted advisors, and agents who control position groups or portfolios wield leverage that is difficult to circumvent. The union balances protection with stability, ensuring collective progress while avoiding direct confrontation with entrenched interests. The result is a system that operates effectively for those who understand and adapt to it, and perilously for those who do not. The next generation of players faces the same design. Rookie athletes entering the league encounter early recruitment, structured influence, financial dependence, and concentrated agency power almost immediately. Each step is embedded within the architecture of the system. Decisions about representation, endorsements, draft strategy, and career planning are mediated by agents whose incentives are aligned with structural leverage rather than purely individual advocacy. Patterns repeat because the underlying incentives remain unaltered. Even well-intentioned attempts at reform confront the problem of alignment. Agents who exploit gaps are often the most effective at portfolio management and negotiation. Teams benefit from predictable access to top talent. Players who challenge the system risk isolation, delayed opportunities, or marginalization. The union, acting as protector and stabilizer, must weigh intervention against political cost. Each actor operates rationally within the system, which paradoxically preserves the status quo, even when individual actions cause harm. The persistence of these dynamics is amplified by culture. Professional football valorizes loyalty, trust, and performance while discouraging open confrontation with authority. Players are socialized to comply, to respect hierarchy, and to prioritize career advancement over public accountability. Early experiences of dependence, financial exploitation, or subtle coercion teach lessons in caution and alignment. These lessons are internalized and propagated to peers and successors, embedding behavioral norms that reinforce systemic endurance. The alignment of incentives extends to media and public perception. Stories of misconduct or exploitation are filtered through layers of representation, management, and narrative control. Coverage emphasizes performance and highlights individual heroics while minimizing the structural dynamics shaping opportunity. Fans, commentators, and even journalists often see only the surface, missing the invisible networks that dictate negotiation, access, and control. This selective visibility preserves the system, allowing structural patterns to operate with minimal scrutiny. Adaptation is possible, but it requires extraordinary awareness, resilience, and strategic skill. From early recruitment and financial dependence to concentrated agency power, retaliation without evidence, and systemic gaps in oversight, every stage contributes to a resilient architecture of influence. The system functions not through obvious oppression, but through alignment of incentives, subtle conditioning, and perpetuation of relational leverage. Players may survive, adapt, or thrive, but the design itself remains intact, awaiting the next generation to step into a cycle that has endured for decades. Early loans, gifts, and favors create dependency, and subtle pressures shape decisions long before rookies comprehend the implications. In many cases, compliance is not voluntary, but an adaptive strategy to navigate an environment that privileges alignment over independence. The stakes are heightened by the economic pressures players face and the social norms within their communities. The system capitalizes on these vulnerabilities with remarkable efficiency, ensuring that the initial stage of career development is deeply influential on all subsequent decisions. From there, the power of representation becomes clearer. Agents, far from neutral facilitators, operate in concentrated networks of influence. Megagencies control position groups, develop strategic narratives, and wield subtle leverage over both players and teams. Decisions about draft positioning, endorsements, and contract terms are often influenced more by relational dynamics than raw performance. The evidence is visible in historical patterns of allocation, anecdotal accounts from players, and documented practices in agency management. Those who fail to navigate this environment carefully those who question advice, attempt independence, or challenge power encounter consequences that are rarely overt but highly effective. Opportunities delayed or denied, reputations subtly undermined, and careers shaped by invisible enforcement. Retaliation without evidence is a defining feature of this system, leaving players uncertain and psychologically burdened. Misappropriation is difficult to detect and even harder to challenge. Shame, delayed reporting, and structural opacity all contribute to a landscape where exploitation persists. Even the most talented athletes are vulnerable. Earning potential and career success provide no immunity from the consequences of misplaced trust. Silence and fear are weapons in this environment, reinforced by cultural norms that valorize performance and loyalty over individual accountability. By the time players recognize the scope of financial misconduct, opportunities to correct mistakes are limited, and the psychological impact is enduring. The role of the NFL Players Association illustrates the systemic balancing act. The union is tasked with protecting players, advocating for their interests, and regulating the certification of agents. Yet structural constraints, political pressures, and the need for collective stability often prevent decisive action in individual cases. Players learn that formal protection has boundaries. The union can provide advice and oversight, but it cannot eliminate structural vulnerabilities or ensure immediate accountability. As a result, patterns of exploitation, influence, and subtle coercion persist across generations. Awareness of these limits becomes a crucial survival skill for those seeking longevity and autonomy within the league. Despite these challenges, some players adapt. Veterans who navigate the system effectively reclaim a measure of autonomy and influence. They learn to identify patterns, question guidance strategically, and negotiate with awareness of systemic leverage. Adaptation is both a professional necessity and an emotional exercise. Survivors internalize lessons from early dependence, exploitation, and structural manipulation, transforming experience into resilience. Yet adaptation, while empowering for the individual, does not dismantle the system. The architecture of influence, alignment, and incentive remains intact, prepared to shape the careers of new entrants in the same way it shaped those who came before. The endurance of the system is not accidental. It is sustained through alignment of incentives across league, union, and agency. Stability is prized over disruption. Compliance is rewarded. Dissent is subtly punished. And structural opacity ensures that patterns are replicated. Efforts at reform are often incremental, symbolic, or politically constrained. insufficient to challenge the fundamental architecture. Reflecting on this system forces questions about accountability. How can structures that operate largely in shadow be held responsible? Ultimately, this investigation reframes agents not as rogue actors or villains, but as products of systemic imbalance. Their behavior, influence, and leverage emerge from the conditions that create dependency, reward alignment, and allow subtle coercion to function invisibly. Understanding the interplay between individual actions and structural design provides clarity on why the system persists, and why players must navigate it with extraordinary care. Accountability, when it exists, is partial and constrained. Autonomy is provisional. Trust is conditional. Talent is celebrated, contracts are signed, and victories are remembered. But the invisible dynamics that govern career trajectories continue to operate, silently and persistently. The cost of trust, the exercise of influence, and the navigation of power are realities every player must confront, consciously or not. Understanding these dynamics is essential for appreciating the full landscape of professional football, beyond the game, beyond the statistics, and beyond the applause. The questions raised do not resolve neatly. How do we measure fairness in an environment structured by invisible leverage? What protections are sufficient when formal institutions are constrained? How can emerging players prepare to navigate a system that rewards adaptation but punishes unawareness? These are questions without simple answers, but they are necessary for anyone seeking to understand the complexity, power, and cost embedded in professional football. The system endures, players adapt, and the cycle continues. Compelling reflection on the delicate balance between talent, opportunity, and structural influence that defines the game at its deepest level. The story of influence, control, and survival is ongoing. The lessons traced here from recruitment to financial exploitation, agency concentration, systemic limitations, and adaptive resilience offer insight into the hidden currents shaping the league. Players are athletes, survivors, and strategists navigating an environment where skill alone cannot guarantee freedom. The costs are real, the stakes immense, and the patterns persistent. Understanding this system requires acknowledging both its human consequences and its structural logic, appreciating the complexity, and recognizing the delicate interplay of trust, power, and agency that defines professional football beyond the field.